The package arrived on a rainy October morning, wrapped in brown paper and bearing water stains from its journey. I found it propped against my apartment door, a simple cardboard box with a return address from a law office in Boston. Inside, beneath layers of bubble wrap and old newspaper, lay my grandfather's journal. I recognized it immediately. The worn leather cover, cracked with age, had sat on his desk for as long as I could remember. As children, my cousins and I were never allowed to touch it. Even my grandmother kept her distance from that book, averting her eyes whenever she dusted his study. Now, 3 months after his death, it had finally found its way to me. The lawyer's note was brief. As per the last wishes of Eric Dalloway, to be delivered to his grandson, Alexander Dalloway, upon his passing. Nothing more, no explanation, no context. Just the journal and my grandfather's silver pocket watch, its face scratched and its hands forever frozen at 3:47. I ran my fingers over the leather binding, feeling the strange grooves that marked its spine. They weren't decorative, not really. They seemed almost like claw marks, as if something had tried to tear its way into the pages, or perhaps, more disturbingly, tear its way out. The memory of my grandfather's funeral was still fresh in my mind. The way he'd looked in those final moments, his weathered face gaunt and pale against the hospital pillows. He'd grabbed my hand with surprising strength, pulling me close enough to whisper his final words. "Keep it buried, Alex. Whatever you do, keep it buried." I'd assumed he was delirious, his mind wandering in those last hours. Now holding his journal, I wasn't so sure. My mother had called the day after the funeral, her voice tight with worry. "Your grandfather's lawyer contacted me," she'd said. About the journal, there was a long pause, filled only with the sound of her breathing. "Alex, maybe it's better not to read it. There are some things, some memories that should stay in the past." I'd asked her what she meant, but she wouldn't elaborate. All she would say was that the nightmares had started after the war, and they had never really stopped. Even 50 years later, my grandmother would sometimes wake to find him standing at the window, muttering in Polish, his hands pressed against his chest as if trying to hold something inside. Now, sitting at my kitchen table with the rain drumming against the windows, I opened the journal to its first page. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but still legible. My grandfather's handwriting, normally so precise and architectural, was here frantic and scattered, as if he'd written in great haste, or great fear. The first entry was dated September 15th, 1943. "They are coming for us at dawn. I can hear their vehicles on the road, the sound of boots in the underbrush. The others say we should run, but where? The Germans have pushed us back for days, herding us like cattle into this valley. This will be my last entry as a free man. If anyone finds this journal, let it serve as a record of what happened here in this forgotten corner of Poland. Let it stand as testimony to the horrors I witnessed, and God forgive me, the horrors I helped create." What follows is my account of my time in Facility 23B, known to its prisoners as Schattengrube, the Shadow Pit. But more importantly, it is the story of what we awakened there in those cursed underground chambers, what we set loose upon the world. I write this not seeking absolution, there can be none for what I did. I write because the evil we unleashed must never be forgotten, and because even now, 40 years later, I can feel it stirring beneath my skin, calling out to its brethren across the void. To whoever reads these pages, you hold in your hands not just a record of atrocity, but a warning. There are places in this world where the boundary between life and death grows thin, where ancient hungers stir in the dark. I know this because I served as their keeper, their collector. This was my job in the camp, the worst job in human history. The next several pages were filled with detailed sketches, the layout of a military compound, guard tower positions, and underneath it all, a maze of tunnels and chambers drawn in shaking lines. But it was the margins that drew my attention. They were filled with tiny, obsessive notes, each one adding another layer to the horror of what my grandfather had witnessed. In one corner, he'd written, "The screaming stops after the third extraction. By then, there's nothing left to scream with." In another, "Gruber says we're serving a higher purpose. If this is higher, I fear to know what lies below." I closed the journal, my hands trembling. Outside, the rain had grown heavier, drumming against the windows like fingertips seeking entrance. The apartment felt suddenly cold, and in the gathering darkness, I could have sworn I saw something move in the corner of my eye, a shadow darker than the others, watching. My grandfather had been a quiet man in life, stoic to the point of silence. He'd never spoken about his time as a prisoner of war, deflecting questions with a practiced ease that I now recognized as carefully maintained armor. What horrors had he carried with him all these years? What darkness had he been protecting us from? I turned to the next page, and as I read, I began to understand why some memories are better left buried, and why some stories refuse to stay hidden in the past. My fingers trembled as I turned to the next entry in my grandfather's journal. The paper was stained with what looked like water damage, but the rust-colored spots told a different story. The date at the top read September 20th, 1943. The march to the camp took 3 days. We moved only at night, our hands bound with wire that bit deeper with every step. They had stripped us of everything, our uniforms, our dignity, even our names. I became prisoner 247. Jakob, the Dutch resistance fighter who walked beside me, was 248. Mikhail, the Russian soldier who had fought alongside us in the forest, became 249. We were no longer men, we were inventory. Our first glimpse of Shatton Group came at sunset. The camp sprawled across a valley floor, surrounded by dense pine forests that seemed to lean away from the compound, as if even the trees feared what lay within. Guard towers rose like skeletal fingers against the purple sky, and above the main gate, I saw something that made my blood run cold. An ancient symbol carved into the stone, one I recognized from my years studying European folklore at the museum. It was the mark of the Soul Eater, a sigil used in medieval times to ward off spirits. But this one was inverted, transformed into a beacon rather than a barrier. Even then, before I understood what awaited us inside, I felt its pull, like a hook behind my ribs, drawing me forward. Herr Gruber met us at the processing station. I can still see him in my nightmares, tall and thin, with wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light like a cat's eyes in the dark. His uniform was immaculate, but his hands were stained dark to the wrists, and no amount of scrubbing seemed to remove the taint. He walked our line slowly, examining each prisoner with the clinical detachment of a man selecting cuts at a butcher shop. When he reached me, he paused. "Your hands," he said in perfect Polish. "They are a scholar's hands." He lifted my personnel file. A museum curator, how fascinating. I said nothing, but he must have seen something in my face, recognition perhaps of the symbols that adorned his office walls. He smiled then, and I wish to God he hadn't. There was nothing human in that smile. "You understand the old ways," he said. "Good. We have need of men who respect tradition, who appreciate the delicate nature of transformation." That night, they housed us in Barracks 7, a long wooden building that stank of fear and despair. Through the gaps in the walls, I could see the guards patrolling with their dogs, massive black beasts with eyes that glowed red in the darkness. But it wasn't the guards or the dogs that kept us awake. It was the sounds that came from beneath the earth. Jakob was the first to notice it, a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to pulse through the floorboards. "Like a heartbeat," he whispered. "But wrong, somehow wrong." Mikhail made the sign of the cross and began to pray. I pressed my ear to the floor, and beneath the chanting, I heard something else. Screaming, yes, but not the normal screams of torture or death. These were the screams of people experiencing something beyond pain, beyond fear. These were the sounds of souls being unmade. In the morning, we learned about the disappearances. Every few days, prisoners would be selected for special duty in the lower levels. They never returned. The veterans, the ones who'd been in the camp for months, spoke of it in whispers. They called it the harvesting. I didn't understand then. How could I? I was still thinking in terms of the world I knew, a world of museums and artifacts, of history safely contained behind glass. I didn't yet grasp that some artifacts hunger, some histories have teeth. Gruber came for me on the third day. He stood in the barracks doorway at midnight, his shadow stretching across the floor like a dark hand reaching for prey. "Prisoner 247, he called. "You have been selected for a position of great importance." As I followed him into the night, Jakob caught my arm. "Remember who you are," he whispered. Whatever they make you do down there, remember who you are. If only I had known then that forgetting would have been a mercy. The entrance to the lower levels was hidden beneath the camp's medical building. A heavy steel door marked with more of those ancient symbols led to a spiral staircase that descended into darkness. As we walked down, the air grew thick and strange, like breathing soup. The walls were slick with something that glistened in our lamplight, and somewhere far below, the chanting continued. "You must understand," Gruber said as we descended, "that what we do here is beyond ordinary science, beyond ordinary morality. We are reaching into the spaces between life and death, between being and unbeing. We are creating something magnificent." He spoke with the fervor of a true believer, but there was something else in his voice, a tremor, a hint of desperation. Looking back now, I realize he was as much a prisoner as the rest of us. The only difference was that he had chosen his chains. I closed the journal, needing a moment to steady myself. The apartment had grown dark while I read, and when I reached for the lamp, my hand was shaking. The light revealed something I hadn't noticed before, a small envelope that had fallen from between the journal's pages. Inside was a single photograph, brown with age. It showed a group of German officers standing before a stone archway. My grandfather had marked one face with a small X, a tall man with wire-rimmed glasses, his hands clasped behind his back. But it was the archway that drew my eye. The symbols carved into its surface seemed to shift and writhe, even in the still photograph, as if they were trying to crawl free of the paper. And behind the officers, barely visible in the shadows of the arch, stood a figure that made my heart stop. It was mostly hidden, but I could see its hands, long, spindly things that ended not in fingers, but in points of absolute darkness. I turned the photo over. On the back, in my grandfather's precise handwriting, were 3 words, "They're still watching." A sound behind me made me jump, a soft scraping, like claws on wood. I spun around, but my apartment was empty, yet in the corner of my eye, I could have sworn I saw something move, a shadow that was deeper than the others, a darkness that had weight and substance. And somewhere, very faintly, I heard chanting. I forced myself to keep reading, even as the shadows in my apartment seemed to grow longer, darker, more purposeful. The next entry was dated October 1st, 1943, and the handwriting had changed, become more jagged, as if each word had been carved into the page rather than written. The ritual chamber lies at the heart of the underground complex, a perfect circle carved from living rock. Ancient mining tunnels, worn smooth by centuries of use, branch out from it like spokes on a wheel. But where do they lead? Every time I try to explore them, I find myself back at the chamber, disoriented and nauseous, with gaps in my memory that span hours. Today I met Dr. Weber, Gruber's specialist in occult matters, a small man with soft hands and dead eyes, who speaks of human souls as if they were ingredients in a recipe. He showed me the soul stone, a crystalline object no larger than my fist, black as dried blood, with something moving in its depths, like smoke, like shadows, like screaming faces pressing against dark glass. "The stone hungers," Weber explained, his voice filled with a terrible reverence. "It must be fed. This is why you are here, Eric. You have an eye for artifacts, an understanding of their power. You will help us prepare the offerings." The offerings were my fellow prisoners. I watched today as they brought in the first one, a young Polish man, barely more than a boy. They strapped him to the altar, a slab of black stone that seemed to drink in the light. Weber began the chant, words in a language that made my ears bleed and my soul shrivel. The soul stone began to pulse with a dark light, and then, God help me, I saw it happen. The boy's essence, his very being, torn from his body like silk from a spool. It wasn't quick, it wasn't clean. I heard him scream in 2 voices, one from his mouth, one from his soul. When it was over, Weber handed me a brass container etched with symbols. Inside was something that moved and whispered, something that had once been human. "Take it to the storage chamber," he ordered. "This is your duty now. You are the collector." I wanted to refuse. I tried to refuse, but the stone's influence had already begun to work on me. I felt its pull, its hunger becoming my hunger. My hands moved without my permission, carrying their grisly cargo through the tunnels. The storage chamber was worse than the ritual room. Hundreds of brass containers lined the walls, each one holding a fractured piece of humanity. They whispered to me as I worked, telling me secrets no living being should know. Some begged for mercy, others offered power, a few simply wept, the sound of their tears like acid on my soul. That night, in the barracks, Jakob noticed the change in me. "Your eyes," he whispered. "They're different, darker." He pressed something into my hand, a small wooden cross, worn smooth by years of prayer. "Keep your humanity," he said. "Whatever it takes, keep your humanity." But humanity is a fragile thing. Each day I felt it slipping away, replaced by something cold and hungry. The Soul Stone's influence grew stronger. I began to see the world as it did, every person surrounded by a glowing aura that spoke of their essence, their potential as fuel for the ritual. Gruber was pleased with my progress. "You see it now, don't you?" he asked, watching me organize the containers with methodical precision. "The beauty of it. We are not just collecting souls, Eric. We are harvesting power itself. With enough souls, we can open the door." "What door?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. He smiled that terrible smile. "The door between worlds, between what is and what could be. The Fuhrer believes this war can be won with tanks and planes, but we know better. Victory belongs to those who control the spaces between spaces." I noticed he had stopped wearing his wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't need them anymore. His eyes had changed too, becoming dark pools that reflected nothing. Like the Soul Stone, they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. In my helmet's reflection that night, I saw my own eyes had begun to change in the same way. The work continued. Day after day, I collected the remnants of those sacrificed to the stone. I learned to ignore their whispers, their pleas, their accusations. I told myself I had no choice, that I was just following orders, the lies we tell ourselves to stay sane. But sanity, like humanity, was becoming an increasingly foreign concept. The more souls I handled, the more I could feel them seeping into me, changing me. I began to dream their dreams, remember their memories. Sometimes I would wake up speaking languages I had never learned, crying over loved ones I had never met. The Soul Stone's hunger was becoming my hunger, its power was becoming my power, and somewhere in the darkness of my changing soul, something ancient and terrible was beginning to stir. I had to stop reading for a moment. The words on the page seemed to squirm and shift, and I could have sworn I heard whispering coming from the walls of my apartment. When I looked up, my reflection in the window was wrong somehow, my eyes too dark, too deep, like wells that led down into nothing. The photograph had fallen to the floor. I picked it up again, studying the figure in the archway. In the growing darkness of my apartment, I could have sworn its position had changed slightly, its pointed fingers now reaching toward the viewer. On my chest, just over my heart, I felt a sudden cold spot, as if something frozen had pressed against my skin from the inside. I remembered my grandfather's habit of rubbing that same spot, his face twisted in pain or fear or both. The journal wasn't just a record of atrocities, it was a warning, and as the shadows in my apartment grew longer and darker, I began to understand that some warnings come too late. The next entry in my grandfather's journal was dated December 21st, 1943, the winter solstice. The writing was almost frenzied, the pen having torn through the paper in places. Gruber's madness has reached its peak. The Soul Stone pulses day and night now, its hunger growing with each sacrifice. We've processed dozens of prisoners in the past week alone. The storage chamber hums with their captured essences, a chorus of the damned that never stops singing. Today I saw what happens to the bodies after the ritual. They don't die, not really. They continue existing, empty shells that move when commanded, but whose eyes reflect nothing. Gruber calls them his vessels. They work in the deepest tunnels, digging ever downward, searching for something he won't name. But I know what he seeks. The Soul Stone whispers to me in the dark hours, showing me visions of an ancient chamber far below, where the barrier between worlds is thinnest. A place where, with enough power, one might tear through the veil entirely. High-ranking SS officers arrived yesterday. They came in sleek black cars, their uniforms pristine, their faces expectant. Gruber promised them a demonstration of the stone's true potential. Tomorrow, he announced, we open the door. I should have run, should have found a way to destroy the stone, to end this madness. Instead, I helped prepare the ritual chamber. My humanity has eroded so far that my hands didn't even shake as I arranged the brass containers in the prescribed pattern around the altar. But something happened during the night. Jakob, my old friend, had been watching me all these months. He and a small group of prisoners had formed a resistance cell. While I was becoming a monster, they were planning. He found me in the storage chamber just before midnight. "Eric," he said, "we can stop this, but we need your help." He showed me an ancient book, its pages brittle with age. They had stolen it from Weber's private collection. The ritual Gruber plans, it's flawed, incomplete. He doesn't understand the price. Inside the book were diagrams that made my eyes hurt to look at, and text in a language that burned in my mind. But Jakob had decoded enough. The soul stone required a final component to achieve its purpose, a pure soul, freely given. Gruber planned to use me as the last sacrifice, thinking my connection to the stone made me ideal. What he didn't know, what Weber's books revealed, was that the stone had already claimed pieces of my soul during my work as collector. I was no longer pure enough to complete the ritual, but I was tainted in exactly the right way to corrupt it. The resistance had a plan. They would create a distraction during the ceremony, giving me a chance to alter the ritual circle. One small change in the ancient symbols, that's all it would take. Instead of opening a controlled door between worlds, we would create a catastrophic breach. "It will destroy everything," Jakob warned. "The camp, the stone, possibly all of us. But it's better than letting them succeed. You've seen what lies on the other side." I had. In my dreams, in the whispers of the collected souls, in the depths of the stone itself, I had seen the entities that waited there, patient and hungry and older than time. The next entry is dated December 22nd, the day of the ritual. The handwriting is barely legible, the pages stained with what looks like blood and other substances I don't want to identify. It worked. God help us all, it worked. The ceremony began at dusk. Gruber had assembled his high-ranking witnesses in the ritual chamber. The soul stone pulsed on its altar, surrounded by brass containers arranged in a complex pattern. The collected souls within them keened and wailed, their combined voices rising to a maddening chorus. Weber began the chant, words that made reality itself shiver. The SS officers watched with hungry eyes as the air in the chamber began to twist and fold like origami made of darkness. That's when the resistance struck. Explosions rocked the upper levels of the camp. In the confusion, I made my move. One symbol changed, one line redrawn. A small thing, a devastating thing. The effect was immediate. The soul stone's pulse became erratic. The darkness in the chamber solidified, became something with weight and mass and horrible purpose. I saw Gruber's face change from triumph to terror as he realized what was happening. The door was opening, but not to where he intended. The void that rushed in was hungry, ancient, absolute. I saw things emerge, shapes that hurt my mind to look at, entities that should never exist in our reality. They took Weber first, their touch turning him inside out in ways that defied physics and sanity. The SS officers tried to flee, but the brass containers burst open, releasing their trapped souls in a tempest of vengeance. The entities from the void merged with them, creating hybrid abominations that hunted down their former tormentors with terrible precision. Gruber reached for the soul stone, trying to control what he had unleashed. For a moment, he almost succeeded. I saw his body begin to transform, power coursing through him like black lightning. But then the stone itself cracked, unable to contain the energies it had channeled. The crack reached out like a bolt of midnight and struck me in the chest. I felt a piece of the stone embed itself in my flesh, felt it burrow toward my heart. The pain was indescribable. Even now, decades later, I can feel it pulse sometimes, synchronizing with the deeper darkness that entered our world that day. I ran. The camp was in chaos. The entities were spreading, consuming everything in their path. The very air had become poisonous with their presence. I remember seeing the vessels, the empty husks of former prisoners, begin to move with new purpose, animated by something from beyond the void. Jakob found me at the perimeter fence. "Run," he said, pressing his wooden cross into my hand. "Run as far as you can, but remember, they'll follow the stone. They'll always follow the stone." He was right. Even now, they're searching. I feel them sometimes, brushing against the edges of my dreams. The fragment in my chest calls to them, a beacon in the dark. This is my burden, my penance for the role I played. I carry within me a piece of that ancient evil, and with it, the responsibility to keep it hidden from those who would try again. To whoever reads this, the door never fully closed. What we unleashed that day still hunts in the shadows of our world, and it remembers. God help me, it remembers. The journal entry ended there. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the page. In the darkness of my apartment, the shadows had taken on weight and substance. They pooled in the corners like oil, and in their depths, I thought I saw movement. The cold spot on my chest had grown larger, more intense. When I looked down, I saw something shifting beneath my skin, a darkness that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. My grandfather's warning echoed in my mind, keep it buried. But I was beginning to understand a terrible truth. Some things can't be buried. Some legacies are written in blood and darkness, passed down through generations like a curse. In the corner of my eye, something moved. When I turned, I caught a glimpse of spindly fingers composed of pure shadow, reaching toward me from the darkness beneath my desk. The hunt had begun again. I slammed the journal shut and backed away from my desk, but the darkness followed. It oozed across the floor like spilled ink, reaching for me with tendrils of absolute blackness. The cold spot in my chest pulsed in response, sending waves of arctic pain through my body. I ran for the light switch, but the bulb exploded the moment I flipped it. In the shower of sparks, I saw them, dozens of spindly figures, composed of shadow and malice, their elongated limbs reaching through the walls, ceiling, and floor. The entities my grandfather had written about had found me. My phone's screen lit up on the desk. A text from my mother. Alex, please tell me you haven't read the journal. Please tell me you're safe. Too late. Far too late. I grabbed the journal and my grandfather's pocket watch, then bolted for the door. Behind me, I heard a sound like reality, tearing, a wet, organic noise that no human throat could produce. The shadows were taking physical form. My car was parked 3 blocks away. I ran through the night dark streets, aware of every shadow, every flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. The street lights went out as I passed beneath them, plunging sections of the road into darkness. They were following me. I needed answers, real answers, not just the fractured account in my grandfather's journal. I needed to understand what I was dealing with before it consumed me like it had nearly consumed him. The university library was my best bet. I'd done my graduate work there, studying European history. More importantly, I knew they had an extensive collection of World War II documents, including records of lesser-known prison camps. The library was closed, but I still had my alumni access card. The card reader glowed green, and I slipped inside. The vast building was silent and dark, but after what I'd seen in my apartment, darkness was no longer just darkness. I made my way to the archive room in the basement. My footsteps echoed off the high ceilings, and in those echoes, I heard whispers, fragments of conversations in German, Polish, and languages that had never existed on this earth. The cold spot in my chest was spreading. When I looked down at my shirt, I saw darkness seeping through the fabric like blood through a bandage. The fragment of the soul stone was responding to something, calling to something. I found what I was looking for in a collection of declassified military documents, reports of a Nazi facility in Poland that had gone dark in the winter of 1943. Aerial photographs showed the camp's layout, exactly matching my grandfather's drawings, but it was the eyewitness accounts that chilled me to my core. A British reconnaissance unit had found the camp 3 months after its destruction. The official report described scenes that the commanding officer could barely put into words. Bodies twisted into impossible shapes, shadows that moved against the light, and dozens of brass containers arranged in patterns that made the observation plane's instruments fail. But most disturbing were the photographs. They showed the ritual chamber deep underground, its walls covered in symbols that the camera somehow captured in 3 dimensions, as if they existed in multiple planes of reality simultaneously. And at the center of the chamber, a perfect circle of absolute darkness that the camera's flash couldn't penetrate. A handwritten note was paperclipped to the file. Site remains contaminated. Local population reports continued disappearances. Recommendation: seal the entire facility and classify its existence. I kept reading, my horror growing with each document. The Nazis hadn't been the first to discover the site's dark potential. The symbols in the ritual chamber dated back centuries. Local folklore spoke of a place where the barrier between worlds was thin, where people would disappear into shadows that walked like men. Gruber hadn't created the evil in that place. He had merely awakened it, given it purpose and direction, and now, decades later, it was still hunting. The lights in the archive room flickered. In the momentary darkness, I saw them again, those spindly figures made of living shadow, stretching impossibly tall, their fingers extending toward me like probing tendrils of night. The fragment in my chest burned cold. I felt it pulse in rhythm with the darkness around me, resonating with something vast and hungry. The shadow beings were getting closer, more solid. In the brief moments when the lights flickered, I could see their faces, or rather the absence of faces, just smooth expanses of darkness that somehow conveyed an ancient, alien hunger. My grandfather's pocket watch suddenly grew ice cold against my skin. I pulled it out and saw that its frozen hands had moved for the first time in decades. They spun wildly, as if time itself was unraveling around me. The journal's pages began to turn on their own, stopping at an entry I hadn't read before. The handwriting was different here, shaky, desperate, written recently before my grandfather's death. Alex, if you're reading this, they've already found you. The fragment in my chest passed to you the moment I died. I felt it break free in my last moments, seeking a new host. I'm sorry. God forgive me, I'm sorry. But there's still hope. The Soul Stone's power can be broken, its connection to the void severed. I never had the strength to do it. The ritual would have killed me, and then the stone would have been free to seek another host. But you're young, strong, you might survive. You need to go back to where it all began. The ritual chamber still exists, buried beneath decades of earth and shadow. The entities guard it, but they can't stop you from entering. You carry a piece of their essence now. You're part of their darkness. Find the chamber, complete the ritual that I couldn't. But be warned, the price is high. To break the stone's power, you must offer something of equal value. A soul freely given, but not your own. Someone you love, someone pure, must choose to take your place. I couldn't do it. Couldn't sacrifice your grandmother to save myself. So I lived with the darkness, contained it as best I could, until I felt death approaching. Only then did I realize my mistake. In trying to protect my family, I've cursed them. The choice is yours now, but remember, the longer you wait, the stronger their hold becomes. Soon you won't be able to tell where you end and the darkness begins. The lights went out completely. In the absolute darkness, I heard movement, soft, sliding sounds like silk on stone. They had found me. My phone lit up again. Another text from my mother. I'm coming to you. I know what needs to be done. Your grandfather told me everything before he died. A mother's love, freely given. It might be enough. The shadows reached for me with hungry purpose, but now I understood their intent. They weren't trying to kill me. They were welcoming me home. I fled the library, but I wasn't running from the shadows anymore. I was running toward something, toward the only chance I had to end this nightmare. My mother's text had made the decision for me. I wouldn't let her sacrifice herself. There had to be another way. The fragment in my chest had become a frozen star of pain, each pulse sending images through my mind. The ritual chamber, the soul stone, the ancient symbols that could tear holes in reality. But now I understood them. The collector's knowledge lived in my blood, passed down through the cursed fragment like a dark inheritance. My phone rang. My mother's voice was breathless, frightened. Alex, I'm at the airport. First flight to Poland leaves in an hour. Meet me there. No, I said, watching shadows pool around my feet like spilled oil. Stay away. I won't let you do this. You don't understand, she said. I've always known this day would come. Your grandfather, he tried to protect us by keeping secrets, but he told me everything in the end. The soul stone doesn't just need any sacrifice. It needs blood of its own. Family. A willing sacrifice from the same bloodline. It's cursed. The shadows rippled at her words and I felt the fragment pulse in recognition. Of course, the soul stone had bound itself to our family line that day in 1943. Its power had passed from grandfather to grandson. Only blood could break blood. "There's another way," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "The resistance. They found something in Weber's books, a flaw in the ritual. That's how they stopped it the first time." "And released something worse," my mother replied. "No, Alex. It has to end. Your grandfather suffered for decades containing this evil. I won't watch you go through the same thing." As she spoke, I felt the darkness shifting inside me, changing. The fragment's cold fire spread through my veins, and with it came knowledge. Terrible, wonderful knowledge. I saw the truth that Gruber and Weber had never understood. The Soul Stone wasn't just a tool for collecting souls, it was alive, ancient, patient. It had allowed itself to be found, had waited centuries for someone to attempt the ritual. The Nazi experiments hadn't summoned the entities, they had simply opened the door to let them come home. And now that door lived inside me. I looked down at my grandfather's pocket watch. The hands had stopped spinning, frozen at exactly 3:47, the same time shown in the photograph of the camp, the same time my grandfather had died. Time wasn't just a measurement here, it was a key. "Mom," I said, "I know what I have to do." The shadows around me had solidified, becoming a shifting forest of dark limbs and reaching fingers. But they weren't attacking, they were waiting. In their depths, I saw faces I recognized from my grandfather's journal. Jakob, Mikhail, all the souls that had been consumed in that cursed ritual chamber. They had never been destroyed. They had been transformed, merged with the entities from beyond the void. And through the fragment in my chest, I could feel their hunger, their loneliness, their desperate desire to make others like themselves. I drove to the airport, but not to meet my mother. The entities followed in my wake, darkening the sky and making streetlights flicker and die. Other drivers swerved to avoid patches of road that seemed to swallow all light. They couldn't see what I saw, the world's true nature, the layers of reality peeling back like old wallpaper. The Soul Stone fragment pulsed stronger as I approached the airport. Not because of my mother's imminent arrival, but because of what lay beneath the terminal, old tunnels, maintenance shafts, places where darkness could pool and gather, places where reality was thin. I understood now what my grandfather had never realized. We didn't need to return to Poland, to the original ritual chamber. The entities had been spreading, preparing, creating new weak points in the fabric of reality. The airport's foundations had been built over one such point. The Soul Stone's power could be broken anywhere the veil was thin enough. The knowledge came with the darkness, flowing through me like ice water. The ritual didn't require a loving sacrifice. It required understanding, acceptance, a willing embrace of what we really were. My grandfather had spent decades fighting the darkness, seeing it as a curse, but the Soul Stone hadn't chosen him by accident. Our bloodline had always been different, had always stood with one foot in this world and one in the shadows. The collector's role wasn't a punishment, it was an inheritance. I found my way to the deepest sub-basement of the airport, past abandoned service corridors and forgotten storage rooms. The shadows moved with purpose now, forming patterns that mirrored the symbols from the camp's ritual chamber. Reality grew thin, permeable. My phone rang one last time. My mother. "Alex, please," she begged. "Don't do this alone." "I'm not alone," I said, watching the shadows dance around me. I never was, none of us were. I took out my grandfather's journal and pocket watch. The fragment in my chest burned with cold fire, resonating with the ancient energies gathering in the darkness. The time had come. Not to destroy the Soul Stone's power, but to complete what had begun in 1943. Not to close the door, but to open it properly this time, with understanding, with purpose. The entities gathered around me, their forms shifting between shadow and substance. I saw Jakob's face in one, smiled at the irony. He had tried to stop this very thing from happening. But some destinies can't be fought, only accepted. I began the chant, words that my grandfather had transcribed, but never fully understood. The pocket watch's hands began to spin again, time loosening its hold on this pocket of reality. The journal's pages turned on their own, adding their stored power to the growing maelstrom of energy. The fragment in my chest pulsed one final time, then began to grow, spreading through my body like branches of dark ice. I felt myself changing, becoming something both more and less than human. The collector's final collection. My last human thought was of my mother. I hoped she would understand. This wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. Our family's true purpose, finally embraced. The darkness took me then, gentle as a lover's embrace, and somewhere in the void between worlds I heard my grandfather's voice, no longer afraid, no longer burdened. "Welcome home," he said, and the door opened forever. In a hospital room 50 miles away, my mother woke from a troubled sleep. The doctors had no explanation for my disappearance, no way to understand the security footage that showed me walking into the airport's lower levels and simply ceasing to exist. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind blows cold, she sees shadows move against their light sources. Sometimes, she feels a familiar presence watching over her, protecting her. And sometimes, if she looks quickly enough, she catches a glimpse of me in mirrors or dark windows, my form tall and elegant, my fingers long and sharp, my eyes pools of loving darkness. I am my grandfather's grandson, the collector's heir, and in the space between spaces, in the shadows between shadows, my work continues. The soul stone's hunger is my hunger, its power is my power, its children are my family, and we are always looking for more.